Okay, our final speaker of the evening is Michael Liehr, SUNY Poly Executive Vice President for Innovation and Technology and Vice President for Research, and more recently, CEO of the American Institute for Manufacturing Integrated Photonics. I'm certain that most everyone in the room is aware of the more than $600 million in public-private partnership funds over a 5-year period that created the AMI Photonics based in New York. And I should add that prior to his life at SUNY, Michael was a distinguished engineer at IBM. He will be speaking on Moore's Law and how we can extend it, what merging photonics with nanoelectronics will do, and how AIM Photonics will play a central role in solidifying the United States leadership in this field. Please welcome Dr. Michael Liehr.
Thank you very much. It occurred to me that I'm speaking as the last speaker of a fairly illustrious group, and it occurred to me that my resume doesn't exactly match to at least the first two speakers. But figuring that I talk to an audience like this, if you think it's right, I mean, please speak up, put a good word in for me with that group that does things in Stockholm. So I also screwed up the title. I apologize that I changed it. So it basically reads what merging photonics with nanoelectronics will do, because nanoelectronics, you'll find out, is a lot smaller pieces and structures than photonics will ever be. So definition first. I mean, the idea here is to really take the elements that constitute an optical system, in this case lasers, waveguides, photodetectors, and so on, and put them on a wafer. And this will be the pervasive theme of the rest of my presentation. I'll circle all the way back to this at the very end of my talk. So what is integrated photonics specifically in terms of what it might do to our lives? And there are really two distinct areas. Commercially speaking, if you look at very big data centers, we have reached a stage where the information flow is really gated primarily by the speed by which we can connect fairly distant pieces within the data center. It's very cost effective to replace those. It is, energy efficient because pushing current through a wire, as you probably all remember, heats it up. That doesn't happen on a fiber. And ultimately, the speed is instantaneous as contrasted to what happens in an electrical wire. So fundamentally, replacing the electrical wiring in a large data center subsequently to smaller and smaller scales, going from rack to rack to eventually within a chip maybe, is the way to go, and that is part of what we're doing here, because the way you will do this is through integrated photonics. The other elements are sort of the right side of this picture here, and that's sensors. I mean, you've certainly heard in the prior presentations that you can use light for all kinds of diagnostic techniques. Here the problem is the cost of these elements, and I'm very specifically here pointing out one example. You do have LiDAR as a potential replacement for radar that allows you to very distinctly, very accurately determine position of objects. It could be used for those self-driving vehicles. And what always cracks me up is that if you look at these Priuses that have one of these gizmos on top, the gizmo on top is more expensive than the Prius. So the whole idea is to really make these systems ubiquitous by making them cheap enough so they can be afforded by everybody. I mean, that's really what drove the microelectronics industry. That's why we keep using the word Moore's Law, which originally really was a scaling law, but by now is an economic law. So the whole idea is apply these principles, see what we can do to miniaturize and make cheaper, primarily make cheaper, the elements that constitute an optical system. So, another perception that I would like to establish very quickly here is what this institute will be all about. This is the same concept behind all these NNMIs. I mean, they were announced by President Obama in 2012. And as you probably all know, the first of these institutes really got funded by telling the DoD and the DOE that they need to find money within their budget and give it to these institutes. Whether that was welcome is a separate discussion, but at the end of the day, these institutes then get to do, to a large extent, what their customer, their funding agency wants. Now, we have an act now that's been enabled that will change that picture somewhat, but this institute here, the one that I manage, is still a DoD institute and therefore will be funded out of DoD funds. So DoD for me is one of my key customers, so to speak. This particular institute here got inaugurated on July 27th. It was in Rochester, New York. We'll have a two-hub structure where there will be a significant presence in Albany, and I'll explain why that is so, as well as in Rochester. Rochester sort of brings the optics community. Albany, New York brings the electronics community. As you heard from my resume, I'm really from the nanoelectronics community, but I've got lots of friends now in the optics community. The other thing that's really important to understand is that these institutes are really not about developing new products. We are here to develop technology that will make or allow people to make these products cheaper, faster, better. So it's really all developing manufacturing technology. And the other thing that's very important to understand is that there's a certain maturity level. This is something that people have started to understand, that in order to have a successful economy, you really can't have science to be disconnected from making products. It's very wonderful if you have a product, a scientific idea that never makes it into a product. I mean, what as a society have you gained? So you really need to invest in this thing in the middle, and people have given it all kinds of names like Valley of Death. But the bottom line is these institutes are all supposed to focus specifically on bridging that gap and helping people across that bridge to make products. So here our institute, again, very specifically focused on that range, and it has a name in terms of the nomenclature. It goes from MRL 4 through 7, and I'll also talk a little bit about what SUNY Poly can bring to the table that goes beyond it. I would like to, not going to read through this page here, but I would like to, of course, acknowledge that we weren't without people helping us. I mean, we're standing on the shoulders of others that have made this possible. And somebody told me at some point, if you do find out about a new proposal from the federal government when the BAA comes out, your chances of winning are slim to none. So you have to really be involved in helping formulate these things. And clearly this community and the people that are with me on this institute have participated in helping to shape the idea in the first place, and now will be part of executing the idea. Here are the members. So needless to say, there's a significant number. Actually, one of the very funny comments was that, why did you guys win? And somebody from the DoD said, well, you guys vacuumed up all the industry, right? So it sort of also gets me back a little bit too. So you see on the left side, of course, the various government agencies. There's quite a number of government agencies. All three services are involved. You have companies here, Intel, IBM, as an example, that compete among each other or against each other very heavily. And then you have universities, and by tiering, by the way, here I don't mean that, for example, Berkeley is a second-class university. It is just to say how many principal investigators are part of our institute. That's what that means. So back to my earlier comment about that committee in Stockholm. If you can see this group here that I have to manage, I did not think of physics or chemistry when I made that comment. I was thinking the Peace Prize. So here's the team. As you can see, we have significant representation from both coasts. So you see Santa Barbara is very heavily represented. I mean, I saw several of the faces, or at least one of the faces I recognized on Nakamura-san's picture as well. We have SUNY Poly, we have MIT, probably as the three main institutions that are represented here on the executive team. Without wanting to go into more detail, the title CEO is something that is actually deliberately chosen. We have a program that will be funded by state and by government, federal government, for 5 years, and then we have to stand on our own. So it's almost like you're on a drug for 5 years that makes you feel really good, and all of a sudden it's gone, right? So this really needs to be viewed as an enterprise in its own, where we have to aim at, no pun intended, self-sustaining operation and income that comes back into the institute. And that is, again, why it's so important, going back to the prior page with all these institutions and all the industrial members, that they are happy with what we do. So I think of this as really a challenge more in making sure that people appreciate our work and want to come back for more, and that we have 5 years to get that done. So we think of this in a fairly corporate way, and I'll show you 2 axes, and I'll then take you to a matrix organization that attempts to emulate this and reflect properly how we're going to do this. So we did a market analysis, and we came back with really what amounts to be 4 industry segments. So I recognize that not all of these interests are properly aligned, but we hope that between the industry segments that there is a reasonable level of overlap that allows us to function synergistically. The one segment that's probably the most mature is the datacom segment. I mean, again, these are the companies like IBM, Cisco, HP, Intel that invested heavily and continue to invest heavily within that particular segment and would like to see that technology mature. Those are the guys with the data centers, right? So the biggest segment, and therefore by far the one that's going to have the highest revenue stream over time. RF analog is very DoD-centric, to leave it at that. The sensor market is the one that really gets into the healthcare business, and therefore has another huge potential in terms of the market. Last time I checked, when I look at myself in the mirror, I'm not getting younger, so I really want to see this succeed. Right? It is, however, the most diverse segment. For us to find a common platform where we can really help that segment distinctly and with dedicated ideas or tools or processes will be harder than in the other segments. In the last tier, the 4th one is phased away. Think of the automotive industry, I mean, my joking example there with the Prius, but it's not just that. I think iRobot, I mean, have a little sensor on an iRobot that allows you to have this thing orient itself better than it can do it today, is of interest to the company. There are, of course, as you can imagine, distinct differences in how much money a company would like to pay for a sensor like that. I mean, if you're adding $100 to an iRobot, it won't sell. On the other hand, or a car is a different discussion altogether. So the last point on this chart is really on the left, on your left. Clearly, industry investments will always be larger. That's a clear case in the microelectronics or nanoelectronics industry than what the DoD or the federal government can do. So the industry will have to drive this in the long run. On the other hand, the scientific as well as our federal organizations can benefit from that investment being made as long as they can have a say in steering it a little or getting specific derivatives for their own purposes being developed. So here are the manufacturing platforms. I mean, this is where the money will be spent. Really 4, and I'm not going to dwell on them in too much detail because I'm running a little out of time, but the first one is electronic and photonic design automation. This is a big deal. There is photonic design automation tools out there today, but combining these 2, think of these operating in very different timing domains. One basically instantaneously connects, the other one doesn't. I mean, how do you simulate an environment like that? How do you determine the flow of logistics to connect the nodes? These tools do not exist today. That is one of the main thrusts of this institute. The next one is much broader than what the name here, multi-project wafer assembly, indicates. We would like to be able to provide hardware for whoever needs it at a low threshold entry price. This might be very interesting for the NSF community in particular, where lots of universities are looking for a means to ride on one of these shuttle ones, but only buy a very small fraction of a field so they can afford it. Here the idea is to do more than just wafers, and this whole photonics or integrated photonics space is dominated by the cost of the assembly. So we added assembly here as an additional service that we'd like to provide. So it's primarily a service offering, but it certainly has elements of what we need to do to develop this better. The next 2 are test assembly and packaging. As I just said, assembly and test are the most expensive steps in integrated photonics. I always think of the simple example, if you try to attach a fiber with a diameter of about 120 microns to a waveguide on a die, which is about 2,000 angstroms. And you need to align this thing, and that's an optically active alignment today. So think of hundreds of little ladies in Vietnam attempting to do this. That's not a cost-effective way. This needs to be fully automatic and passive. So here's an approach of what we need to do to allow this to happen. And the last one is inline control. This is a fab manager's nightmare. You're building a product, it comes out the other end 4 months later, and you find out it's bad because you couldn't test for whether it works. Today, the microelectronics or nanoelectronics industry has all these test structures on a wafer that they measure electrically, because that's what we know what to do, but there's no such thing optically. So clearly, this is a major manufacturing enhancement to develop an optical tester or something that tests the optical characteristics as you build it. And the last one, we're very heavily focused, of course, on workforce training and education. I'll have a separate page on that. So putting this thing together here is really like an organization chart in a large company. You have the groups that provide the technologies, and you have the industry segments that provide the pull and say, this make a difference in my business. So having these two things together and having two executives of the institute that work hand in hand and are responsible for each of these axes is what makes it work. We have a very aggressive timeline. We're trying to stand this institute up by January 1st. That's about 5 months. Most of the institutes that I've looked at have taken well over a year to get stood up. Again, as a result, it'll probably be a little messier than most people would like to see it, but I think it's of benefit to get it done. Even if it's slightly off, we can always make course corrections. But you'll see us coming out with a set of proposals by probably next week, and then have a final budget approved by our leadership council, the equivalent of a board, by the end of the year. For timing reason, I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but we do have a very active effort on workforce development and education that really spans the whole range. I mean, it starts with the trades. I mean, you do need people who know how to assemble a tool, or how to help assemble one of these parts that I just described, all the way up to a PhD that really knows how to do these designs. This entire chain here will be part of what we're addressing. There are a significant number of community colleges that were on the list that I showed earlier about how many institutions are part of us. Those community colleges will help us tremendously. New York actually has over 30 of them that will participate in this activity. So, one quick glance at, why did we think we win it? I mean, I think there are really two criteria. One is the kind of people and the kind of institutions that we were able to bring together. Jokingly, I say, we had a very close working relationship with MIT, and I asked the guy at MIT, well, name the person that you're losing most of your proposals to, get him on the team. And, if you do that consistently, you end up with a top-notch team. And I think that's a large piece of what we have here. And we have all skills that are complementing each other, so it's not like we have a lot of redundancy in there. And the second one is, well, we have industry relations. I mean, I'm a good example. I mean, I have a long career in IBM, and I'm not now here at this institute. We have the most vested or invested industry members in the country on the team. And we have, the SUNY Poly organization that I'll talk to in a second. Just another little joking comment here. The Infinera transceiver is a marvel. I mean, 500 gigabit per second. So you can take the entire Library of Congress and ship it from coast to coast without repeaters in 20 seconds. So when I told the Vice President Biden that when he was at I said, well, but who needs it? He looked at me and said, insomnia. So the Albany Nanotech complex is a key element of what constitutes here the capability that we're bringing to the table. This has the size of a modern nanoelectronics factory. We have nearly 140,000 square feet of clean room. If you go to any normal university, you find something that's maybe 5,000 square feet. So we are the size of a factory. We have a fully equipped tool set, all 300 millimeter state-of-the-art tools. The companies that are with us, that I'll speak to in a second, do leading-edge CMOS logic development on-site. And we have been in this business of doing photonics, integrated photonics, for at least 5 years, and have tools that allow us to build parts that are superior to everything else that we have seen. So this gets to the last chart that I have here. So back to what I said at the very beginning, let's take the elements of an optical system and put them on a wafer and then bring to bear the infrastructure that the semiconductor industry has developed over 40 years. They didn't do this for the hell of it. They did this because it makes economic sense. The fact that you all carry a cell phone that, in the 80s would have been the size of your desk is because the semiconductor industry has taken the cost out of making these things. Every year, the cost of your semiconductor chip goes down by 25%. I don't know how many of you realize that, but that's really the Moore's law. Now, you don't ever see this because at some point you're getting more function for the same price because the industry has quickly figured out that people are willing to spend $500 for a PC, and therefore they just give you more for that. If you ever tried to buy a printer, you can't buy a simple printer anymore. It does all kinds of things short of making coffee for you. So the idea of the semiconductor industry, cost-driven wafer manufacturing, all 300 millimeter, the transition to 300 was made for cost reasons. It's cheaper to do that. You have all the top-tier equipment suppliers on it. You have leading-edge processes. Packaging and supply test chain, it's all there, right? Established consortia. I mean, I used to be the first general manager of the Global 450 consortium. Sematech is on site, and you see my pretty face there on this picture. It was also on here, as you can see, on BBC. I got a lot of grief for that picture, by the way. I'm never in the clean room, so if people just see me in the clean room, it's just, well, what are you doing there? Did you get lost or something? But so the whole point is, I mean, we do have a lot of experienced semiconductor professionals that can bring that knowledge and the connections into the supply chain to this institute and really apply that to photonics and integrated photonics. Now, why is that needed? Why didn't it happen? Well, these processes are not standard. I mean, if you show that picture at the bottom right to a semiconductor guy, oh my God, everything in the semiconductor world is, straight lines, and they're all 90 degrees. So to see curves and stuff like that, I mean, people get scared. Now, you can wrap your arms around it, and eventually you can make it happen, right? It's also all silicon, so we need to start integrating, depending on the wavelength, other materials, optically active materials like indium phosphide. There's different ways to do that, and we will figure that out. And of course, the founding infrastructure is very immature. Now, you've seen the SUNY Poly facility. We can do more than MRL7. We can actually build products, so we can take it all the way to MRL9, which is a help to some of our industry partners. Okay, so with that, I am done. You see another nice picture of the IBM 7 nanometer chip that I was pointing at in that picture, and a 450 millimeter wafer, which will eventually come. Thank you.